And he couldn't really see much future in school, so he decided that he was going to leave school and he was going to be a rock climber and do this sort of for a living. And so he got this in mind. He figured he had everything he needed to have a life as a rock climber. He had a down vest, he had 2 red bandanas, he had climbing socks, he had a V-dub. Oh, and he had $75. That was it. And so he was ready to go. And so one Sunday morning, he decided, I'm going to go off and start my life as a rock climber. On his way to go to Yosemite, where he's going to forge his new life, he stops by the house of a friend by the name of Randy. And Randy was this, basically a chaplain at the school that he went to. And Randy was pretty cool, he figured, because Randy had a Triumph motorcycle, he had a beard, and he had a girlfriend. All 3 things that Bob Goff wanted at that particular age. And so as he was going off to his new adventure, his new life, he thought he would stop by and go and see Randy and tell him about the new life that he's about to have. And so he knocks on the door in the early hours of the morning, and Randy opens the door. Bob tells him the plan that he's got to start his new life. It's rock climbing in Yosemite. And sort of bleary-eyed after a while, Randy says, oh, well, hang on for a moment. Can you just hold on for a second? And so Bob stands at the door, Randy runs inside, and he comes back downstairs, and he's got a tattered backpack and his sleeping bag. And he just simply says to Bob, I'm with you. I'll go with you. Bob's sort of a bit thrown. He didn't expect it. The last thing he possibly expected. And I guess a bit about his confusion about the way in which Randy just replied to him. He said, yeah, sure. Come with me. And so they mount up into the V-dub and they drive their way to Yosemite National Park. And by the time they get there, it's sort of late in the evening. Bob realized he hasn't actually planned anywhere that he's going to stay. And he barely has any money to pay for anything anyway. And so they find one of those platform tents, those pre-set up tents with a wooden floor. And they sneak into the back of that and they sleep there for the first night. And they sleep right at the back of it just in case somebody comes, they can sneak out of it. Right? And so they sleep there their first night. And then the plan is they're going to go into the valley the next day, and Bob's going to apply for all these different jobs. Because he thought, I'll work for a couple of hours a day somewhere in the valley, and I'll go climbing the rest of the time. And so he went and applied for all these different jobs in the valley. And he sat down, he'd fill out a form, he'd take it to the person, the manager, and say, I'm applying for a job, and they'll just simply say, no. I mean, there were no jobs in the valley, particularly for somebody who hadn't finished high school, that had no climbing experience, had no real experience at all. And he got no after no after no. So after going through a day of applying for most of the jobs in the valley, they figured they needed somewhere else to sleep that night. So they figured the tent they slept the night before was still free. And so they snuck in the back of that tent again and slept there for the night. Throughout the night, Bob can barely sleep because his mind's running through how his plans for the future aren't exactly panning out the way that he thought that they would. But nevertheless, Randy's there with him. And in fact, when he's applying for different jobs, Randy was there cheering him on, saying, go for it, you can do this, you'll be right. And was just supporting him through this whole ridiculous adventure. And so they sleep through the night, and Randy snores and Bob doesn't. And so Bob gets this sort of half sleep sort of stupor that he gets through. He sort of muddles his way through the night, and then he wakes up the next morning, and as he wakes up, there's Randy, and Randy says, hey, let's go climb some rocks. And so they spend the rest of the next morning just climbing and doing some climbing and teasing each other about their prowess as mountain climbers. And then they go down to the valley, and Bob applies for the last remaining few shops and retail outlets and businesses in the valley that he hadn't applied for the day before. And again, there is nothing. And it gets to midday, and he fills up his V-dub, and he's got basically a few bucks left out of his 75. And he recognizes this is a bust. And so he has no money. Randy offers to shout him lunch, which he buys him lunch. And then Bob turns to Randy and says, I think what I'll do is I think I'll head back and finish school. And Randy simply says, whatever you decide, I'm with you. I'm with you. So they drive home, 6-hour drive. Randy's respectful enough to let Bob be quiet and just process the adventure and the dashed dreams that have occurred over the last couple of days. And when they arrive home, for some reason, Bob follows Randy into his home. And as he comes to his living room, he notices there's all sort of gifts that are being half unwrapped. There's like a microwave. There's a coffee machine. There's a whole bunch of stuff. And you think, was it Randy's birthday? I remember being Randy's birthday. And then as they're there, out from another room comes his girlfriend and says, "Hi, honey." And she throws her arms around Randy and says, "Welcome back." And it dawns on him, they just got married. And Randy had dropped everything for this teenage boy that turns up on his doorstep and spent a couple of days with him, and he's trying to figure things out in Yosemite National Park. And Bob Goff, he made this observation. He said, I realized I wasn't a project. I was his friend. I don't think anybody likes being a project. I don't think anybody likes being an agenda. What we want to be is people that are seen and people that are valued. I think everybody wants that, for somebody just to see you and say, "I'm there with you. What do you need? I'm there with you. I'll stand with you." And yet, to do that, to be with somebody, there's often a cost and a sacrifice. To do that, to stand with somebody, to be with them, to be all they need in a particular moment. To want to be somebody who says, "I'll put aside my needs for what is best for them, what is best for the other person." And that, in a sense, is part of what this passage, for all that sort of offensive, for all that sort of controversial stuff in it, that's at the heart of this passage that we're looking at today. In the end of Ephesians 5 and the beginning of Ephesians 6. See, throughout Ephesians, what Paul's been doing is been painting this picture of this new community, saying that because there's this new community, once you get to know Christ, you become part of a new community, and all the barriers that used to separate and all the barriers that used to divide us, they've all gone, they've all been removed, and God seems to be doing something in you, in your character, in the essence of who you are, and you ought to be changed, and we become a community that is not just about for us, we're a community that is for others, that is for people. A community that dares to believe that people matter. And Paul's sort of been painting this picture. And as he paints this picture, he's saying we're trying to forge this new community, but he's aware that he's doing this in the midst of a prevailing culture. This new community he's forging doesn't live in isolation. It's actually trying to give birth, or he's trying to give birth to it in the midst of a culture that thinks very, very differently to some of the things that he's talking about. A patriarchal culture where men ruled, where unilaterally all authority was in the hands of men, and that women and slaves and children were all held subordinate positions to the men. And that's a culture that Paul's writing these words to. And fundamental to the way this community worked, the way this society worked, was that they said at the core of our communities, core of our societies, are households. And how households work and the structures within households seem to have a flow-on effect. And the Romans believed in this so strongly, they actually had laws to protect what they called household codes or household structures, the way in which people worked within households and their status and the responsibilities within their household. And so you have different people writing different what we call household codes, different ways in which households are supposed to be structured and work. And so Paul wants to write a household code. He's saying, okay, I'm trying to give you a picture of this new community, and we live in a prevailing culture. How does our household code compare to the household code in the world that we live in? And so he gives them instructions on how this new community could possibly try to live out some of its values in the households that they find themselves in the midst of the prevailing culture in which they live. So that's the context for the words. Now, in September 2009, London's Telegraph newspaper ran an article called the Top 10 Worst Bible Passages. And they hadn't compiled the list, they'd nicked it from somewhere else. And the top 10 worst Bible passages had the types of passages that you would expect to be in there. There were passages about genocide. There were passages about smashing infants on rocks. There were passages about sending concubines off to be raped by others. There were about ill-conceived vows that cost a father his daughter. There are those sort of passages. But what was really surprising, in that list of top 10 were actually 2 verses from this passage that we're looking at today. Wives, submit to your husbands, and slaves, submit or obey your masters. Because in our culture, in our day, they're quite frankly offensive. And I can understand why they're offensive. Perhaps you can understand why they're offensive. It sounds like this is for the subjugation of women. It sounds like it's condoning slavery. Now, when Paul penned these words, I think they were subversive. I think they were revolutionary. I think they were offensive, but for utterly different reasons than for the reason that we find them to be offensive. Remember, they were written to a society that is extremely patriarchal. Everything is geared toward a male-centered world. And by the way, Paul wasn't the first one to write this sort of thing. There are plenty of other household codes around. Let me give you a couple of examples so you can understand how Paul's stand in comparison to some of the other household codes that went around at the time. Philo wrote these. Other rules again, there are of various kinds. Wives must be in servitude to their husbands. A servitude not imposed by violent ill treatment, but promoting obedience in all things. Parents must have power over their children to keep them safe and tend them. The same holds of any other persons over whom a man has authority. Jewish historian Josephus, this was some of what he wrote in a household code. The woman, says the law, is in all things inferior to the man. Let her accordingly be submissive, not for her humiliation, but that she may be directed, for the authority has been given by God to the man. And then Aristotle wrote, he said that the authority is ordained by nature. He said, as between the sexes, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, the male ruler and the female subject. Right? If you vomited in your mouth a little bit, then that's okay. It's a perfectly natural reaction to what Aristotle just said. All right? But they're the household codes of the day. That's what people would think. And so, because we value equality in our culture, in our world, words like superior, inferior, servitude are offensive. But the consensus in the ancient world, in the ancient writings, was that men were superior, so they should rule over women, they should rule over children, they should rule over slaves. And so you get these household codes, guys like Philo or Josephus or Aristotle, and what they're saying is, hey, we need to protect the order of society, so we're going to tell you how your household ought to work. And that's the world that Paul is writing to. And he's writing a household code with this new community that finds itself in this particular culture. And so what do we do? The reason I give you that background is very, very important, because what happens is we can take what Paul wrote and we drop it into our culture and we go, whoa, it seems like he's taking things back from where we've arrived. And yet you understand, when he's actually dropping them in the culture over here, he's actually doing something very, very different to what we assume. And so when you look at household codes, particularly when Paul writes it, one of the key things to understand is don't look at what Paul said that was actually the same as the household codes of the day, because everybody said that. It's what did he say that was different? In what way was he pushing the envelope? In what way was he stretching people's thinking? In what way was he saying the nature of our households, the nature of our communities, the way that our faith works out, how is this different from the prevailing culture to which he wrote at the time? And so how does Paul start his household code? He starts in a really unexpected, provocative way. He says this, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now that word submit, I don't think that's one we use very much in our culture in our day. I don't think anybody likes the idea of submitting or being submissive or taking a subordinate role to anybody else. Because when we hear submit, we tend to think of, oh, that's about power and that's about authority. Perhaps that's about force or coercion or tyranny. And maybe there are all these sort of images that come to your mind when you hear that particular word. But what's really interesting is that when Paul uses the word submit here, if I can get a little nerdy for a moment on this, he uses a particular tense, which I think is really, really important to understand what he's doing here. In the Greek, you have 3 different tenses or voices. Right? We only have 2 in English, so we don't pick up what he's doing. In English, we have an active voice and a passive voice. In the Greek, you have also a thing called a middle voice. So an active voice might be, in our culture, for example, the cat ate the mouse. Right? That's active. The passive voice would be, the mouse was eaten by the cat. So what's the middle voice? It's this. The mouse chose to be eaten by the cat. Right? That's what Paul's saying here. Not that we're the proverbial mouse and others are the cat, but what's saying is, this isn't about somebody forcing you to submit. This is about you choosing to submit. It's not about power. It's not about coercion. It's not about all that. It's about, in our economy, in this household that we're creating, this new community, you choose to submit to one another. Everyone submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. They said we don't like the idea of submit because we think it carries ideas of coercion and violence and power or loss of dignity. That is sort of this top-down thing. But no, Paul's actually talking to us. He's saying that the choice to submit is always in the hands of the one choosing to submit. It's never about others forcing them or forcing somebody else to submit. That's why he chooses the middle voice to do what he does here. And so what Paul is saying, hey, you ought to choose to submit to one another. And it's not about a sense of hierarchy. It's about people who are saying, are you willing to express humility? Are you willing to say, I'll be there for you? That I'll put aside my needs, my agenda, my desires, my preferences for the sake of you? Will I take a subordinate role for the sake of you sometimes? And Paul's saying, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And he's saying, what would it look like if we're a community where rather than just having this thing where this person exerts influence or authority or power over another, that there is sort of this community of mutual submission where people care for one another. A scholar by the name of John Stott picks up on this idea. He makes this observation. He goes, it is true that wives are to submit to their husbands, children to their parents, and slaves to their masters. And that this requirement of submission, hypotage, which is the Greek word, presupposes authority. Another Greek word for authority is exousia, in the husbands, parents, and masters. Indeed, these two Greek words complement each other. Yet the word exousia is not used once in this passage. On the contrary, explicitly or implicitly, he warns them against improper use of their authority, forbids them to exploit their position, and urges them instead to remember their responsibilities and the other party's rights. See what he's saying? If Paul's writing household codes about who has power and who has authority, he says you would expect him to use the word exousia. That's what John Stott is saying. Okay, the primary concern of Paul here is not, hey, if you've got power, make sure you wield it in the way that I'm telling you to wield it. No, he's saying, actually, the mark of us is that we'll be humble, that we'll be submit to one another, that we're prepared to take subordinate roles for the sake of others. He's going, that's what this is about. He said, if this was about who's got power and who's got submission, he said you'd expect exousia and hypotage together, because we don't get that here at all. What we get is we actually get hypotage. Submission is a choice in Paul's code. It's not forced or coerced. So Paul says submit to one another. And then he jumps into his code, and he starts where every other code would start. He looks at wives and then children and then slaves, because they will be present in every household. He's not condoning particularly slavery, right? But what he's saying, if these are present in households, how do we function in this world? How has all that I've been telling you about how to live out as a new community, if we're going to be countercultural, and if the center of the way in which our societies function is the way in which our households are structured, he's saying, what ought our households to look like? And to the wives, he says this: wives, submit to your own husbands, as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church, his body, of which he is the Saviour. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Too many people, guys in particular, memorize that first verse and quote it. Guys, it's not for us. There's plenty in this passage for us to tell us how we ought to behave. This verse isn't for us to quote to our wives, because what's submission? It's in the power of the one choosing to submit. It's not about a submission about, hey, I'm coercing or forcing you or telling you you have to submit. It's for the person to make a choice to submit. It's in the middle voice. It's not there for us to quote. And in the light of the world that we live in, we can read this passage and you can understand why perhaps it's that Telegraph's top 10 list of offensive passages, because it says, you read this in light of our culture, you say, oh, is this saying that we're going to roll back women's rights? We're going to go back to a time when women were exploited, when they were treated as slaves, where they had very few rights, where they couldn't vote, where they couldn't own property, where they couldn't hold office, where they were barred from higher education. Is that what Paul's saying? Hey, let's go back to the good old days. Is that what Paul's saying? No, because I think what we find throughout Scripture and throughout the life of Jesus is he continues to elevate the dignity and the worth and the value of all people, particularly women, in his culture. You know, because there was this patriarchal attitude that saw women as not having the same value as men. You know, Jewish men would get up in the morning and they would pray, Lord, I thank you that I'm not a Gentile. I thank you that I'm not a slave. I thank you that I'm not a woman. Such was the status of women in the culture. And yet Jesus treated women with such dignity and respect. He meets a woman at a well. He's got a past. He's from the wrong side of a wrong culture, the wrong beliefs, and he treats her with dignity and respect. He encounters a woman caught in adultery and he restores her. Jesus had women disciples. Rabbis didn't do that. He had Joanna, he had Mary Magdalene, he had Susanna. It was unheard of. The resurrected Jesus appears first to whom? To women. There's no advantage legally to appear to women in that day, in that age, if you're trying to establish testimony, but he shares this moment with them. And even the teachings of Paul. Paul's not coming along saying, I just want to contradict and correct what Jesus got wrong. That's not what Paul is doing at all here. Nor is even Paul trying to contradict what he said before. Because he himself talks about the fact that those old barriers are being removed. In Ephesians, he said there's no longer Jew and Gentile. In Colossians, he goes on to say there's no longer slave or free. And in Galatians 3:28, he says there is male or female. He's saying, guess what? All those barriers are gone. All those divisions are gone. All those hierarchies are gone. We're equal before Christ. And so what's Paul saying here? He's saying to the wife, submit. But he's saying to everybody, submit. But every household code of the day told wives to submit. That wasn't new. But they were told to submit because they were inferior. They were told to submit because the men had authority. But here they say, no, we're not going to play that game. If you're going to choose to submit to somebody else, it's not because you're inferior. It's not because they're more powerful and more important than you. You can do it out of reverence for Christ. By the way, just like everybody in 5:21. So wives, submit to your husbands. And when he does that, he's doing something really, really interesting, because here's somebody in culture that's so often treated as second class. He's not just saying, like other household codes would say, hey, you're inferior, submit. He's saying, I'm asking you to submit, and let me give you a reason why. And he argues his case for why she ought to do it in that context. He's inviting her to a particular way of life. But he's treating her with dignity and respect in doing so, by including her and giving her reasons for this choice. Then he writes to children, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and you may enjoy long life on the earth." Now, these are instructions to children who have no value in that society at that time. People love their kids, but they didn't really have much worth. And in fact, in some outside of Jewish culture, some other cultures, they really had very little value or treated almost kids with indifference. It wasn't uncommon in parts of the Roman culture for unwanted babies to be discarded, to be put on rubbish dumps, to be abandoned in the forum as used for slaves or prostitutes. Sometimes they were just seen as a bit of a nuisance because they complicated divorce if you had kids. That was the attitude. And if you're a child, you would have known that. And so to a group that is hardly recognized, to a group that has no power, that has no status, that has no influence, again, he says obey, but then he gives them a reason to obey. He doesn't say, "Oh, obey because you're a kid. Just do what you're told." He says, "Obey because you know what's right." And if you're going to submit out of reverence to Christ like everybody's supposed to, then hey, let's go to the commandments. If you want to honor God, what does it say? Obey your parents. He actually quotes the 5th commandment. What's really, really interesting is that we've got the 10 commandments, and most commentators or scholars would say the first 4 have to do with loving God, and then the 5 to 10 have to do with loving others. In Jewish thought, it was slightly different. Jewish thought, they'd say, hey, we have 2 tablets with 5 commandments on each. And so the 5th commandment had to do with how do we love God. Right? And the logic that Paul's using here is saying, hey, your parents have been entrusted with a responsibility to raise you with a knowledge and awareness of God. And if you love me, trust them, obey them, so that you can learn how to know me and love me. And so he gives them dignity. He's saying to people, the children that are ignored, children that have no value, no worth, hey, I want you to do this. Let me tell you why. And then he says to slaves, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know that the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is slave or free." If you want to understand the attitude of people towards slaves, Aristotle, you probably liked before today. Right? You might not like him after the quotes today. This is also what he said about slaves. A slave is a living tool, just as a tool is an inanimate slave. Otherwise, it's just a tool. It's got no real value. Estimates are that there were 60 million slaves in the Roman Empire. They had no rights. The master could do whatever he wanted to with a slave. Your punishment could include whipping and mutilation. We could rip out your teeth. We could gouge out your eyes. We can brand you. We can confine you. We could execute you if we wanted to. Now, not everybody would do that, and it wasn't not necessarily looked on favorably if you did those things. But if you did, your slaves had no recourse whatsoever. They had no value, no worth, no standing. And yet here's Paul. He's saying, how do our households function? Because I'm addressing you, slave. You have value and you have dignity. And I want to give you a choice. I want to give you a reason for the choices that you can make in the context that you find yourself in. And so I keep saying, whether it's a wife or whether it's a child or whether it's a slave, hey, you live in a culture and you're used to a household code that tells you you're worthless and you have no rights and you're just inferior and you have to do whatever. He goes, that's not the way it works here at all. And I'm asking you to submit out of reverence for Christ, like I'm asking others to submit out of reverence for Christ. But I'm going to show you dignity and respect and ask you to do this. It's a radical thing. He's saying to them, you have value, you have significance, you have your own mind to make your own choices in the way in which you behave. It's a radical thing that Paul would even say this to them. And I think he's saying, don't you believe for a moment that you're worthless. Don't you believe for a moment that you don't have choices in this. Don't you believe for a moment that you can't choose to do the right thing, not because you're coerced to, but because you have a mind and a will of your own. And you have a value in the dignity. So I will address you, I won't coerce you. I'm saying to you like with everybody else, I want you to submit in the passive voice out of reverence for Christ, to be the man or the woman or the child that I call you to be. See, Paul gives them reason to explain. You don't explain to a tool why it needs to do what it needs to do. You don't explain to livestock why it needs to do what it does. You explain to a human why it needs to do what it needs to do. And so Paul's treating them as people, that they have rights and they have responsibility, and he's restoring their humanity. Scholar N.T. Wright makes this observation. He says, Paul has thoroughly Christianized the code, not just by adding in the Lord at certain points, but by balancing carefully the duties and responsibilities of the various family members so that the stronger parties have duty as well as rights, and those who are in a position of submission are treated as responsible human beings with rights and duties. So he said to those that are in positions of weakness, I'm going to treat you like a human. You have a choice. You have power. You have dignity. I'm going to treat you. I'm going to talk to you as a human being. We're not going to coerce you and force you to do anything. And then he says to those who actually have the societal position or power, he's saying, now, in our new community, you need to start thinking about how you're going to use this position the society's giving you, this culture's giving you. And so he says to husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. How is he to treat his wife? He's to love her. And he's to love her in the same self-sacrificial way that Christ loved the church. He's saying, guys, if you want to know how you do it, your wife isn't your possession. You've got to love her. And if you want to know the model, how did Christ love the church? Well, he gave himself up so that she could be holy and blameless. In other words, he gave himself up. He sacrificed himself. He gave all of himself so that she could be all that she could be. So that she realize all that was placed in her, all that was possible within her. He's saying, husbands, that's your responsibility. If you have this positional power, that's what you're supposed to do. That's a radical call for husbands who saw women as objects, or little more than somebody who would run the household and look after the family. It's a radical call that Paul's making here. See, in Paul's world, in the ancient world, the men had all the rights, the women had none. And Paul's saying, no. Husbands, I want you to value your wives as you would value yourself. In fact, he changes the metaphor. He says, in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church. He goes, look after your own body. You nourish it. You care for it. You make sure you're okay. Treat your wife as if she was your own body in exactly the same way. Love them, love her the way that you love yourselves. Treat her as an equal. It's really interesting. In the Greek, to tell the wife what she needs to do, it takes 40 words. To take the husband, to help the husband understand what he needs to do, it takes 90 words. Saying, it's like, guys, you don't get this. Guys, we live in a culture where you're just used to having your own way, where you think you're above and superior, and you just treat your wives and your children and your slaves as objects. I'm going to make it really, really clear what I'm expecting of you. So he's saying, if you've got power, societal position or power, what are you going to do with what I've given you? And to parents he writes, fathers or parents, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. This is a world where fathers ruled the roost. They were sovereign at home. You could sell your children as slaves if you wanted to. You make them to work, go to work in the field. You do whatever you want. And so what's the instruction to the fathers that have that sort of power? Do not go, do not exasperate, do not provoke your children. In the same ways, your job as a husband is to help your wife realize the potential of all that she could be. Do the same for your kids. But it's not about your aspirations for yourself. It's not about your unmet dreams. It's not about any of that. It's about submitting and serving your children so they might know and love Christ. That's what Paul's talking about here. And then to the slave masters he writes, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So masters, treat your slaves the same way. Same way as what? Same way as I just told the slaves to work, right? I told the slaves to work wholeheartedly as if serving the Lord, to give their very best to you. And now the masters, I'm saying, you do the same. Back to your slaves. You treat them and serve them with respect and do it wholeheartedly. In case you're wondering, nobody talks this way in the ancient world. Nobody says this sort of thing to masters. This is how you treat your slaves. And so what do we do with all this? If you're the person who has a power or authority or position and society gives you that, it's got to raise the question of what do you do with that power? How do you use it? You will have people that you have authority or influence or position over. How do you use that power? Are you going to be like a Randy? He says, okay, I have authority or power, but I will put aside my self-interest or my own interests. And I'll come on this crazy trek for a couple of days in Yosemite just to say, I'm here with you. Because I want to see you become the person you can be, but then somebody is to travel with you, and I'll submit. I'll take the subordinate role at this time so you can be who you need to be. I thought about who are those that don't have power and position. In our society, I think often elderly, disabled, refugees. If we're in a position to do something about that, there's some instructions about what do we do with the position we've been given. Because Paul's saying sometimes you have to challenge the status quo. Sometimes you have to rethink the position you've been given and how do you use it in a way that honors God. And sometimes it's putting aside or subordinating your own interests, your own self for the sake of others. You serve one another out of reverence for Christ. Or maybe you feel like, hey, I feel like I'm in that other category. And you feel beat down and knocked down and beat up. You feel worthless. And you feel like, I feel like people look at me with disdain. I'm that second class. I don't rate. I don't count. I don't have a voice. What Paul's saying in the household code, what God is saying, is don't you believe it? Don't you believe it? I see in you a value and a dignity and a worth. And we're not going to treat you as inferior. We're not going to treat you as second class. You have a right to choose, and we'll treat you as a human being, not as stock, not as a tool, not as anything else. We'll treat you with dignity and respect, because that is what every human being deserves. And so the call in this new community is not to be the people who go after the hierarchy, that go after the power. But Paul says, how do we be people that wherever we are, that we're prepared to subordinate ourselves, to take the posture of humility, to submit ourselves to some degree to one another out of reverence for Christ, so that we can say to somebody, I'm there with you, I want you to be all you can be. I want you to know all you can be. I want you to experience all that you can be. And I'll put aside my rights, my position, and everything society wants to give me so that you can know that. If you're my wife, I want you to achieve all the potential that God has placed in you. If you're my children, I want you to achieve all the potential that you. If you are someone who is ostracized or marginalized by society, I want to give you the dignity and the value and the respect that you deserve. And so what Paul says here is utterly countercultural. He's pushing the thinking ahead and he's saying, let's be this countercultural community. And he says, in a sense, and where does it start? It starts at home. Get this right at home and let's see how this works its way through the world at large. Let me pray. Father, God, admit we probably all still feel, in some sense, that aversion to that word submit, to be subordinate. And yet, Father, help us to realize that it doesn't make us inferior, it doesn't make us less, it just makes us humble. And look at all the things that Jesus submitted himself to, and he was never inferior to us, he was never less than us, but he had submitted himself. That humble himself, become obedient to death. And to go to a cross so that we could be all that we could be, so we could know that all that we could be, so we could experience the life that you want us to have. And so perhaps we just need to follow Jesus' example there, Lord. To be prepared to be humble, to be prepared to be sacrificial, to be able to give away perhaps what we're entitled to for the sake of another. Father, help us to do this. Help us to do it out of the choice to be people who submit. And that, Father, in doing so, that we will remind those that are nearest to us and those that are in our sphere of influence, those in our lives, that they have tremendous dignity and value and worth, and that they matter. They matter to us and they matter to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.